Morning. Welcome to Intermediate Inquire Part 1. This is the first part of what is intended to be a three-part series. Um, I hope everyone can hear me okay. You guys should have the manual that goes along with this, the Impact Intermediate Inquire manual. I'm going to be following it very closely, and I'm going to be referring to like some screenshots and some explanations in the manual. So it'll be good to have to refer to through the course of the session. Um, so, um, first of all, to get started, in designing this course, I kind of assumed that you have a basic understanding of Inquire already, that you can perform some basic searches and things, and that this is intended to build off of that basic knowledge. So to do that, we're actually going to spend the first little while outside of Inquire. I'm going to talk about some concepts and some database structure theory that will help understand how Inquire actually works and what it's actually doing. So that's where I'm going to start. If you guys will turn to page 2, the first page of your manual, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the data is actually stored in our database that you use Inquire to search. So first I talk about tables, database tables. I'm sure you guys have all heard this term before, a table in the database. How I kind of visualize it is kind of like a spreadsheet, rows and columns, which I'll talk more about in a second. So generally, a table is going to be a collection of related data. So for instance, in real property, you have the parcel tab is information from the pardat table. It's the parcel data table. And that table is going to hold that same information for a bunch of different parcels in a bunch of different tax years in a bunch of different jurisdictions. And that's one table, that pardat table, which you can see a screenshot of on page 2. And there are other tables. You might have the own dat table, which is the owner information, or the dwell dat table, which is the dwellings data. So you have a bunch of different tables that hold different information for specific parcels. So taking that spreadsheet analogy a little further, if you look at the explanations of records and fields, again, that first screenshot on page 2, it says example of pardat table in database. You can see where there's that one record highlighted for parcel 18503 is the horizontal record where you can see the juror is 12 and the parcel ID number is 18503 and the tax year is 2017, etc. From left to right is the information on the pardat table pertaining to that one parcel. That's what we call a record. So on the other hand, what we call a field would be the same thing as you think of a column in Excel. So that field is the vertical highlighted in that screenshot. And in that screenshot, the field that I highlighted is the ADR STR field, which is where the street address is stored. And you can see where there's apt to be different data from parcel to parcel in the same field. Although it doesn't have to be. You can see in that screenshot that the top 60% or so of the parcels in the screenshot are on Johnson Crossing, I would guess. I don't know, it's cut off. And the rest of them at the bottom are on Saddle Club Lane or Drive or whatever. So you can have, in a particular field, you can have the same data from parcel to parcel, or you can have different data from parcel to parcel. But what's important to understand about the structure of the table is that the horizontal row or record is the data of a bunch of different fields pertaining to one parcel, and that the vertical field is all of the data in a specific field across parcels. So that's how the structure of the table works. And then in that second screenshot below, I'll go ahead and pull up a parcel so that you guys can be looking at it on my screen as well. That second screenshot below, it shows basically the same data for that parcel that I have highlighted, that 18503. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. me change to my county assessor role. So where that first screenshot is looking at the table in the actual database, the raw table, what maintain does, what the application does, is for that table, I'm looking at pardat, so that's displayed on the parcel tab in real property. And if you hover over a parcel, you can see you get that label that says pardat. So what the application, the website, the impact program is actually doing is when you open a parcel in maintain, it's going out to all these different tables and finding records that have the right juror number. See, it knows I'm in juror 12, you can see up here. Records that have the right tax year, it knows I'm in tax year 2017, and records on all these tables that have this parcel ID number. So what maintain does is goes out and finds all the records that belong to this parcel in this county in this tax year and pulls them all together into one layout. And then you can tell from tab to tab which table you're on. So the parcel tab is a conglomeration, I guess, of the pardat table. And you can see in those screenshots on page 2 where some of that data translates. So like in the first screenshot, you can see highlighted the highlighted record for this parcel. The LUC tab is the parcel's property type, and it shows 11. It's property type 11. So you can see in that second screenshot where the property type field is, right here, well, there's that 11. It's that's where that piece of data is pulling from. And again, with most of these fields, I think most of you will know this, most of these fields you can hover over and it will tell you the name of the actual field in the database. So there's my LUC tooltip, is what that little floating label is called, a tooltip. So if I hover over that property type field, it tells me LUC. So now I know I'm on the pardat table, and this field is the LUC field. Or I could do it with any of the others. This one happens to be, the class field happens to actually match the name of the database, the name of the field in the database, which they don't often. And here's that street address field, the ADR STR with Johnson Crossroads in it. So you can kind of see here how maintain gathers data from different tables and compiles it all into one place for a single parcel. Which brings me to, if you look on page 3, the top of page 3, I talk about what a parcel is. So we're all kind of used to thinking of a parcel in the obvious, like, geographic terms. It's a piece of land that belongs to a person that we have to appraise and levy a tax bill for, right? But the concept of a parcel in impact, or in terms of the way data is stored in the database, is kind of a different concept. So when you think of a parcel in impact, what you're really saying is that there are these records that exist on a bunch of different tables that are all related to each other by their jurisdiction number, their tax year number, and their parcel ID number, their PARID number. So kind of like I was saying, when you open a parcel in maintain, like I've done here, it goes out, maintain goes out to values, is the APR val table. It goes out to the APR val table and looks to see if there's a record with these values, these juror, PARID, tax year values, and displays the data here. And then it goes to pardat, like I was showing you, and finds a record with this juror, PARID, and tax year. And then it goes to owndat, et cetera, et cetera. So it goes and collects all the records from different tables and compiles them all in one place to show us the data that pertains to what we think of as a single unified parcel. And the reason that's important is because you can have situations where a particular parcel might not have a record on a specific table. So for instance, this parcel that we're looking at doesn't have a dwelling listed on it. So if you went and looked at the dwelldat table for this juror, PARID, and tax year combination, you wouldn't find anything because there's nothing there. This parcel does not exist on the dwellings table. nor the additions table, nor the commercial buildings table is COMDAT. So, or on OBY apparently. So you can see that uh, uh, what we think of as a parcel is just a collection of records on different tables. On the other end of the spectrum, the land table is going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 records for this parcel. And we'll talk here shortly about uniquely identifying records that might have multiple. Sorry, hang on. We'll talk about uniquely identifying records here in a minute. But for the time being, the thing to understand is that that's what a parcel is in impact. When we're talking about a parcel, we're talking about, in terms of the way data is stored in the database, we're talking about a collection of records on different tables. So one of the side effects of that, one of the side effects, I guess, and I'm sure you guys have probably seen this happen before. If you go to the property records module, one of the things about the property records module is that whether you're in real property or personal property, it is kind of designed, it was designed with whole parcels in mind. So when you're looking for a parcel here or a personal property account, what it's going to do is, for real property, if you're looking for a parcel, in order for it to be returned in property records, it has to have a parcel tab and an owner's tab. It has to have a PARDAT record and an OWNDAT record. If it's missing one of those, either of them, or both, then it will not be returned by searching for it here in property records. And I'll show you an example of that, because I've prepared one. Let me pull up, I'm going to look for parcel 97.1, and I'm not going to get anything back, which I know ahead of time, because I've orchestrated all this. No, go away. So, if I look for this parcel 97.1 in Chester County in 2017, I don't get anything in property records. And by the way, I'm using Chester County data because they're not actually on our impact system, but we had converted their data a couple of years back, and we've kept it as data that we can do things like this with. So that's why I'm using Chester County here. So I've searched for this parcel, and I haven't gotten anything back. And I may know from prior experience, if I'm hypothetical situation, I'm in a county and I know this parcel exists out there somewhere, so why am I not getting results back? If I go back to maintain, if I can find it, and look for that parcel here, yes, leave this page. If I look for 97.1 here, I should get results back. It's going to take it a minute. See, when it's loading like this, it's going out and querying all the different tables. So here's my parcel, right? So why is it pulling up in maintain, but not in property records? Well, like I said, for property records, to find a parcel, it has to have a PARDAT tab, a PARDAT table record, and an OWNDAT table record. So if I go look at parcel, which is the PARDAT table, there's nothing here, right? So what happened? Well, if I turn on this deactivated checkbox up here, there's my record. So the fact that just this record is deactivated, even though the rest of the parcel is still intact, the fact that the PARDAT record is deactivated prevents the property records module from being able to return it. Because like I said, the property records module is, the concept behind it is that it's intended to look for entire parcels. So if something is missing a record like that, then it's not considered a whole parcel. So that is one of the benefits to using something like a tool like Inquire instead of property records to look for parcels. Because it might be a little more involved, a little more complicated to run an Inquire search, but if you run an Inquire search and look for PARDAT records or OWNDAT records or assessment records or whatever, if you're only looking at one table in Inquire, then you're going to get what's on that table, regardless of what records might exist or not exist on other tables, unless you start including more tables in your query, which we'll cross that bridge later. But for the time being, if I were, for example, to go into Inquire and look for this parcel on the assessment table, I would get these records back because they're here and they're current. And running that search, which is basically bring me everything from assessment for this juror, pared, and tax year, well, in that case, that doesn't matter whether the pardat record is deactivated or currently active or what. So something to keep in mind, if you're ever looking for a parcel in property records, a parcel that you're relatively sure exists, and it's not coming back, search for it in maintain and see if you can find it. If you can't find it there, go into Inquire and search a few different tables. Look on the pardat table, look on the owndat table, the legdat table, the assessment table. Those are the usual suspects, the basic tables that a parcel should have in order to be whole and complete. So in the same way that the property records module for real property wants a parcel to have a pardat record and an owndat record in order to be returned, the personal property records module has a similar function, except it's looking for an owndat record and a ppadmin record. So personal property has records on a table called ppadmin, ppadmn, which I think most of you would be familiar with. Personal property has records on the ppadmin table, whereas real property parcels have records on the pardat and legdat tables. So you can kind of think of the personal property ppadmin table as taking the place of the parcel and legal tabs in real property. They're kind of switched in and out. Both tables are both role types, real property and personal property, do use the owndat table though. However, if you pull up a personal property account, which let me do real quick. Let's go to 28. So while both real property and personal property do use the owndat table, in the real property transactions, multi-use and assessment administration, things like that, that tab is called owners. In the personal property transaction, that tab is called account info. So this account info tab in personal property, see my tooltip says owndat, is pulling from the owndat table, just like the owners tab in the real property transactions are also pulling from the owndat table. So just because the tabs are called something different between real property and personal property, they are actually pulling from the same table. And in the same way that, like I said, in the same way that the real property PRM wants a parcel to have an owndat record and a pardat record, the personal property records module wants an account to have both a ppadmin record and an owndat record, or it'll do the same thing. If one of those was deactivated on a personal property account, it would not be returned in the property records module. Which I can go ahead and show you that too, since we're here. So that account that I have pulled up right here, we're looking at it. You can obviously see that it's an active account, that it's currently active and has records out here, right? It's 281001. But if I go look it up, I'm not going to get any results back because this is one that I had previously deactivated the ppadmin record on. I set these up for demonstrative purposes. So yeah, now that I've covered that, okay, so that's the idea of a parcel and impact. Like I said, is records on different tables that are related to each other through those jur, pared, and tax year fields. So that brings me to the next thing, the next concept on page 3 is that concept of key fields. And there are screenshots there, but I'm going to go ahead and open Inquire just to show you a little bit. And the screenshots are from the Pardat table, so I'll go ahead and grab it. I'm going to change this to business areas and go to Camma Pardat. So on any table that you load up into Inquire, when you get to this part, you've got the table loaded and you click on the table to see the fields on that table. These are the Pardat fields. At the top of each table, you'll have a certain number of fields that have this little key symbol. And then underneath the key fields, we call these key fields, which makes sense, right? Then underneath the key fields, you'll have the rest of the fields on the table in alphabetical order. So you may be wondering, okay, what's special about these key fields? What's going on here, and I keep referencing that, you know, a parcel is a collection of records on different tables that have the same jur, parad, and tax year, right? So there's something significant about these fields, the values in these fields. What makes these significant, what makes these key fields, is that on this table and some others, for any specific combination of these values, jur, parad, and tax year, you should get one record back. So that's what makes the key fields important, is that for any given combination of those three fields, they will uniquely identify a record. So if I wanted to, I'm going to do this first of all. I just want to pick a parcel in Chester County, 2017. So I'm just going to pull everything. I want to make sure to get current records. So I'm going to turn my cur equals y. You always got to put that, right? So if I only wanted to see this parcel, it's an easy one, 722. If I pull jur, parad, and tax year for jur 12, parcel 722, tax year 2017, I'm only going to get one record back. If I wanted to select everything on the table, I would get this long list of mostly empty fields. So this is all of the data for this parcel that exists on the Pardat record in Chester County in 2017. So that's what makes these key fields important. That's what makes them key. That's why they're considered key fields, is because for any combination of values in these three fields, I'm only going to get one record back. So if you think about the implications of that, what that means, it's a little easier to understand. So for instance, if I changed any one of these, I would be apt to get a different record, a record that belongs to a different parcel, right? If I changed my jur from 12 to something else, to some other county's number, well then I could very likely pull parcel 722 from tax year 2017 from some other county. That parcel could very well exist in many other counties, more likely than not. So that's why that jur is a component of the uniquely identifying fields. Same for the parad field. Obviously, if I leave the jur and tax year the same, 12 and 2017 respectively, and change that parcel ID number, then obviously I'm moving from parcel to parcel within Chester County 2017. I'm looking at different parcels. And by that same token, if I change the tax year, if I change the tax year back to 2016, well then I'm looking at technically the same parcel in the same county, but it's a prior year version of that parcel. So functionally, as far as impact is concerned, it's a different parcel. And I think that's something that a lot of users have difficulty wrapping their heads around, is that from tax year to tax year, what we think of as the same parcel that's just existed throughout tax years is treated in impact as a distinct parcel in each tax year. So if this same parcel existed in 2014 and 2015 and 16 and 17, we would think of it as a historical chain pertaining to one parcel. But what it really means for parcels in the database, and I may be able to show it here, is that they are different parcels across tax years. I'm going to take this tax year condition off. So I'm just going to pull all Pardat records. What I'm doing is pulling all Pardat records for this parcel in Chester County. So this parcel only exists in 2 tax years, but you can see it has 2 distinct PARDAT records because one of them is the one from 2016 and one of them is the one from 2017. So that's why these 3 fields on the PARDAT table and on the LegDAT table and on a lot of those basic foundational parcel tables, these 3 fields, juror, PARD, and tax year, are the key fields. They're what is going to uniquely identify a record or a parcel. Let me consult my notes. So there are other tables that have more or different key fields. And if you keep in mind when we talk about key fields, the idea of a key field is to be able to uniquely identify a parcel, right? So, so let's look at a table that has a different key field configuration. Remember, we were looking at that parcel earlier. Let me go back to it. Because it really helps to illustrate this if I have the parcel open. Go to 97.1. So remember, like I was saying earlier, when you're going through this parcel, what maintain is doing is going out to all these different tables and finding records that exist for this juror, PARD, tax year combination. So one of the effects of that is, like I said, most of these tables, like parcel, PARDAT, and this is the one with the deactivated record, remember, most of these tables, like PARDAT and APR val is the values tab, and LegDAT is the legal table, most of them are only going to have 1 record per parcel, per juror, PARD, tax year combination. But some of the tables, like land, for instance, could have multiple records. Oh, this isn't the one I was looking at. What was I looking at earlier that had multiple land records? Oh yeah, it was 18503. So some tables, like the land table or the dwellings table or additions or OBY, any of the improvement tables, the sales table, can have multiple records per parcel. It's called a many-to-one relationship. You have many records, multiple records on this table that belong to one parcel. So you can see in this example, this parcel's land table has 6 records. So if I go back to Inquire and pull up the land table, comma land, see, land has that extra key field. The other tables, PARDAT, LegDAT, I think, only have the 3 key fields, juror, PARD, and tax year, because any combination of those 3 fields will uniquely identify a record. The same can't be said for the land table, for instance, or any table that has or is apt to have multiple records per parcel. And I can show you that here. Juror, PARD, and tax year. L line. I'm going to say cur equals y, because you always want to put in cur equals y, right? I'm going to say juror equals 12. PARD equals 18,503. And tax year equals 2017. So you might be inclined to say, looking at this, well, this is one parcel in one county and one tax year. I should only get 1 record back, right? But when I run it, I get those 6 back, because that parcel has 6 records on the land table. So in this instance, defining that juror, PARD, and tax year no longer uniquely identifies a record. In cases where you're on a table where a specific parcel can have multiple records like this, then there has to be an extra identifying field in order to uniquely identify. On a lot of these tables, it's going to be that L line field. Land has the land line is what that stands for. And that's why I included it in my output results here. As you can see, that's how it uniquely identifies. So if I wanted to get even more granular, even narrower, if I was only looking for a specific, maybe I only want to see the L type U, the land type unit, is a typical way to identify like home site lines on ag parcels should be listed as L type U, while everything else is listed as L type A. So if I wanted to narrow that down, I could do that way. But if there were multiple records with an L type U, then it still wouldn't be unique. The only way to get truly unique on the land tab, the land table, is to include that L line parameter. So if I said I only want to see L line 6, then it's going to isolate out this bottom record. Then, since I have discrete values defined for each of my 4 key fields on land, I'm only going to get one record. So just like earlier when I was showing you the pardat table and how the combination of those 3 key fields on pardat, jurpard, and tax year retrieve one unique record, and changing any one of those 3 values is going to change which record I'm pulling, but still only one. The same is true here for 4 key fields. Now I have 4 key fields that I can change the value of any one of them and get a different unique record, if that record exists. I'm apt to get 0. If I wanted to pull landline 8, I'm not going to get anything because there's not a landline 8. But as long as I have something in all 4 of these fields, I'm certainly not going to get more than 1. So that's how the concept of those key fields works. That's what those key fields is for. If you ever load up a table and you see these keys, that's why these are isolated up here at the top like that, is because they do have a special significance as far as identifying unique records. And again, that's something that, from a theoretical, like conceptual standpoint, it's okay if it doesn't make absolute sense right off the bat. The more we work with these queries and tables, the more you'll see how this, all these concepts play into everything. So that's how those key fields work. I'm over on page 3, the bottom of page 3. I'm going to show you all a little bit. I'm going to explain these show and comparison fields a little bit. So in Inquire, there are a couple of different functions that you can perform right off the bat within this window, right? The first 2 I want to talk about are these show field and the comparison and values fields. So the show field, if you ever hear me use the term select, like I'm selecting such and such data to return in my results, that's what the show field is for. Show and select can be used interchangeably. So in this instance, this query that I've got set up right now, what I have selected to show are these first 4 lines, the jur, parid, tax year, and L line fields. And I don't have anything else selected. The comparison field is just that relational operator. And you guys are all pretty familiar with this. Some of them, like jur, is only equals or not equals. I don't think you can do, I might be in the wrong role. For those of us state users with access to multiple jurisdictions, there might be another option there. But for those of you in the counties, you will only have an equals option there. But most of them have like various different options. These are called relational operators. Equals, not equals, like between, enlist, are you can define the operation between the field you're looking in and the values you want to find in that field, right? And then the values column, as the name implies, is where you put in, the value you want to compare to whatever's there. It's pretty straightforward, the way the comparison and values fields operate. What I really want to point out by talking about these show and comparison and values fields is that you can select a piece of data to show. You can check the show box. Like if I wanted to I'm on the land tab. If I wanted to see the number of acres, I want to see the number of units on each line, then I can select that field. I can click that box to show it, and I don't have to put anything in the comparison or values fields. Like, I don't want to restrict my data based on that acres field. I just want to see what's in the acres field. So I've checked that box. If I click execute, it's going to tack that onto the end of my query. Now it's showing me the acres. So that now I know line 3 on this parcel has 13.4 acres. By that same token, in the same way that I can select a field to show without using it as a comparison benchmark or as a condition, I can also use a field as a condition without selecting its show. Just like I've done down here. I've set cur equal to y. I'm telling it I only want to see records where cur equals y. I don't want to include it in my results because they're all going to be y, right? I don't need to include them because I know what it's going to be. I've defined that in my query, that I'm only looking at currently active records. So there's no need to include it in my results. So you can set that condition on a field without including the field itself in your output results. So all I'm trying to get across here is that you can show fields in your output results, or you can you can condition on fields using the comparison and values fields mutually exclusively of each other. You don't have to do both. You can do one or other without doing the other. Right? Sorry, I'm consulting my notes to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Another example, so that's the show and comparison and values operations. Another example of the key fields being different I want to show you guys before we move on. I'll start a new query. And I had mentioned how the key fields are going to be different for any table that's apt to have multiple records per parcel, right? The land table, the dwelled at or commed at tables, the sales table is particularly interesting in this regard. So I'm going to pull up the sales table. What's interesting about the sales table is that it does not have a tax year field, which throws a lot of people off at first. But sales records are not restricted to a specific tax year. What this means is that you could pull up a parcel in 2017, key a sale to it, and commit it and everything, and then if you wanted to pull that parcel up in tax year 1986, there would be nothing there for that parcel except a sales record. You could go over to the sales tab and maintain and see that sales record because it's not restricted to a tax year. It's going to show up in all tax years, which makes sense if you think about it from an administrative standpoint. Whichever tax year you're looking at that parcel in, that sale is relevant, right? So you could go back and look at it 15 years ago. You might still want to know that it sold last month and that the owner changed in the future tax year. So because of that, coming back to these key fields, for most of the basic tables, like I keep saying, part at, like that, etc., you're going to have one record per parcel, per jur, parid, tax year combination. But since the sales table doesn't have a tax year field, it instead substitutes this sale key field. And I'm sure you guys have all noticed these sale keys. May not have known exactly what purpose they serve, if any. And they do several things behind the scenes. And this is one of the things that they do. One of the purposes they serve is to provide uniqueness to these sales records. So if you think about it, again, if you look for sales records with a specific jur and parcel ID, you could be apt to get many records returned. Just like what happened with the land records on that parcel a second ago. When I looked for that jur, parid, and tax year, I got 6 land records back because that wasn't enough to uniquely identify records. So in the same way here, I could have a parcel in a specific jurisdiction that has as many sales records as you can key on. It could have 10, 12, 15 sales records. So if I just look for that jur and parcel combination, I will get all of those sales records back. But each of those sales records will have a unique sale key. So by including the sale key condition, that's that final layer of uniqueness for the sales tab. And this is one of those, it will be probably rarely necessary for you guys to know that specifically, but it is good to know that, to be aware of the fact that the sales table does not have a tax year field, because that could cause some confusion. To get around that, what you want to do is, if you want to look for things in specific tax years, you want to use the sale date field, SALEDT. You can look for specific sale dates, or sale dates. I think you could probably do like between maybe January 1st of this year and December 31st of this year. And that way, even though you can't look at a specific tax year, you could find sales records that occurred in a specific calendar year. Or you could find things, you could even look at the when field. That's a little less reliable, because if somebody, I could have keyed a sale today, and then next week somebody goes in and whatever, changes the adjusted price on that sale record, well then that when field is going to change. So that might not be completely reliable, but it'd be a good benchmark. Anyway, I'm getting off topic now. The point here is that these key fields are apt to change from table to table, is the broader point, and that if you're looking to identify unique records, that's something to pay attention to, is how those key fields behave on each table. So moving on to, I'm on page 4 now. So at the top of page 4, at the bottom of page 3 and top of page 4, I talked about the comparison function and the values function. And then there's a screenshot on page 4 that shows that you can use the comparison and values fields without having to select the field you're conditioning, and like I've done with the jur field in that screenshot. Or alternatively, you can select a field to show in your results without conditioning by it, like I've done with the valasm2 field in that screenshot. So the next concept, and this is another one that is kind of difficult to wrap your head around in the abstract, but will make more sense as you see it applied while we're working on these queries. The idea, about halfway down page 4, the idea of grouping data, especially when we get into talking about the dynamic fields that we can define ourselves. I'll talk more about how data groups. So basically what it is if you want to run some kind of aggregate function, is what they call basically a mathematical expression. If I'm running one of those dynamic fields and I want to find a sum, like I want to add everything in a particular field together, or I want to perform some other kind of like user-defined mathematical expression, then that expression will be applied to the groups that I've defined. And again, if that doesn't make sense to you now, it's not something to worry about. I will harp on that as it's happening later. I'll show you practical examples of how that data grouping works. So don't get too hung up on that right now. I'll circle back to that. So the last couple of like kind of vocabulary I want to talk about. At the bottom of page 4, I talk about the distinction between deactivating a record and deleting a record. So this is something that can cause some users confusion, I've seen in the past, and it's a point where it may seem to you guys like we're nitpicking over the distinction between deactivating and deleting, but they are two words that mean very different and very important things. They're both important words in terms of the data in the database, and so using the correct word in the correct context can make a lot of difference. And so the reason for that, or the distinction between them, let me explain that. So when a parcel is deactivated, or not a parcel, a record, I'm sorry, because that's an important distinction too, the distinction between a parcel, remember like I said, as a collection of records, and one of those individual records. So if a record is deactivated, like that parcel I pulled up earlier where I had deactivated just the pardat record, the rest of the parcel was still active, but that pardat record had been deactivated. Or if you had a house burn, I think that's probably the most common occurrence, like the most common instance where a record on a parcel is getting deactivated, but the parcel itself is not, is if you had a house burn, you'd have to go delete that sketch and deactivate the dwellings and additions records, right? So what you're doing when you deactivate that dwelldat record, the dwellings record, is the record is staying there. All you're doing when you deactivate that record is that cur field, C-U-R, is being set to D. It changes it from Y to D. And what that does is, it does a number of things actually. What that does is, first of all, the parcel maintain then knows when it's calculating values for the APR val tab and for the assessment tab, if that dwelldat record or OBY record or comdat record or whatever has a cur equals D, it's not to be included in the values that it's calculating for that parcel. So that's the first thing, is don't include that record in values. The record stays there, and we can go look at it if we need to for historical purposes, but it's not included in the values that are stored on that parcel. The other big thing that does, setting that cur field to D, deactivating that record, the other big thing that does is when it comes time to do tax billing and rollovers, when it comes time to roll you into the next tax year, our rollover jobs go table by table, parcel by parcel, and find all of the records that are currently active and copies them forward. So our rollover jobs, and there are multiple jobs that have to be run in succession to roll an entire county up to the next tax year, those jobs know that if a record's cur equals D, the cur field is set to D, it doesn't get rolled. It gets left behind. It does not get copied up into the future year. So those are the two big functions of that cur equals D field. And that's why, like I've mentioned a couple of times here this morning, if you're setting up any kind of query in Inquire, you always want to set, whatever table you're on, you always want to set that cur equals Y. Because generally speaking, you're not going to want to include deactivated records in your results. There are probably instances where you may want to go look for deactivated records, and in that case you would want to set your cur equals D, so only find the deactivated records. So it works both ways. In general, the cur field is going to have one of those two values in it. It's either going to be a Y if it's currently active for yes, or it's going to be a D if it's deactivated. If you're looking at the pardat table or the owndat table or whatever, it's going to be one of those two things, a Y or a D. And the reason it's like that, the reason it's not yes or no, Y or N, or active or deactivated, A or D, is because if you ever do any kind of querying with the history tables, history records cur field is set to N. So they're not deactivated, but they're also not current. So the history tables themselves are kind of beyond the scope of this class. That's one we may save for if we do an advanced Inquire later. We'll talk about querying the history tables because things can get really complicated really quickly using history tables, because then you're getting outside the realm of these unique identifiers. In history tables, you're apt to have multiple records per parcel on a given table. So we're not even going to get into history tables at the moment. But for our purposes today, what this cur field drives on the normal, what we call the core tables, the pardat, owndat, legdat, assessment, APR val, this cur field is always either going to be Y for currently active or D for deactivated. So that's why we've always harped from the beginning. Always set your cur to Y. When you're doing an Inquire query, always set cur equals Y. So that's what deactivating a parcel is. All deactivating, or not a parcel, I keep saying a parcel, I'm sorry. That's what deactivating a record is. All that happens when you deactivate a record is that it changes that cur field from Y to D. And then the system knows, because cur equals D, it knows not to include any values that belong to that record in the total parcel value, and it knows not to roll that record forward into the future tax year. So in the example of a house that's burned, so you had this parcel that had a house on it, the house burned, and you've gone and deactivated the house, and now the parcel is vacant. That deactivated dwell.dat record still exists on that parcel in the current tax year, but then at the end of the year, when we roll into the future, the new version of that parcel will be truly vacant. So if you go look at the future tax year, what is now the current tax year where that parcel has rolled to, there won't be any dwell.dat record on it, current or deactivated at all, because the deactivated dwell.dat record was left behind in the year you just rolled out of. Anyway, so that's what deactivating is. Deleting, on the other hand, is, I think, what most of us understand the term to be. Deleting is getting rid of it altogether. It is then irretrievable, because a deactivated record can be reactivated, right? The data is still there. So a deactivated record can be reactivated if you need to. A deleted record is truly gone. The only way it could be recreated would be by rekeying the record in itself, literally recreating it from scratch. Deleting records is something that on most tables, you county users, don't have the option to do. Most tables, it will not let you delete records. There are a couple of exceptions, couple of notable exceptions. The Notes tab, when you delete a record from Notes, it is truly deleted. It is not deactivated. So that's one place. And I think, I want to say like the entrances and permits tabs behave the same way, I think. But those are the only three examples off the top of my head that I can think of where you guys, you end users, can truly delete records. So you can kind of see that's the distinction between deleting and deactivating, and why it's such an important distinction, because records that have been deactivated are still out there, can still be accessed from a data perspective. They're still there. They're just in a slightly different configuration. Whereas deleting a record removes it altogether. It's gone. And then the last kind of piece of vocabulary I want to talk about this morning is the idea of a null value. And you'll see why in just a minute. But the idea of a null is another thing that can be difficult for people to wrap their heads around. For a field to be null, truly null, there has to be nothing in it. So that's different from a field that has, say, a 0 in it. Like if it's like a value field. For a parcel that is completely vacant, there are no improvements on it at all, then if you looked at the assessment tab, that improvement value field would have a 0 in it. Well, that field is not null. It has a value in it. That value is 0. And understand what I mean by value is kind of like this, the values column in Inquire is implying. Value in this sense is not a dollar amount. It's just some piece of data. It could be a dollar amount. It could be the letter Y. It could be Johnson Crossroads, like in the street address field on that other parcel that we were looking at. If I go back to Pardat. So the value that's in this ADR STR field for this parcel is Johnson Crossroads. So that's all I mean by value, is what piece of data. So for a field to be null, like this field, for example, ADRNO, the address number field, right here is null. It doesn't have a 0. It doesn't have a space. There is no value in it whatsoever. And that, I think, can be the most difficult thing for people to understand, is that if I put my cursor there and hit the space bar, well, it's not going to do anything. Nope. There it is. So if I put my cursor in there, right now this city-state field, it's city name is the name of the field, is null. There is nothing there. If I hit my spacebar once, you see my cursor move a little bit. If I were to commit this, that field would no longer be null. It would look like it's null, but that space itself is a value. Even though there's no visual representation of what a space is when I hit the space bar, it looks like empty space. It is actually a value is stored there. So that's kind of what a null field is the absence of any value whatsoever. And where that becomes significant for our purposes today, it's significant in a lot of different ways. And as you do more Inquire queries, you may bump up against that null value in some interesting ways that I'm not going to get into. But what it's significant for today is for talking about how the assessment table works. So the next couple of pages, page 5 and the first half of page 6, I'm going to talk about the assessment table. So I'm going to kind of build off of that concept of null because it is very important. I'm going to pull up this parcel that I've got a screenshot of. So the screenshot at the bottom of page 5 shows this parcel that I've created is a multi-use parcel. So you guys may be familiar, or hopefully familiar. We've been telling you for years since we started doing impact training, if you run an Inquire query, then just like we've always said, you want to set cur equal to y. If you're querying the assessment tab, the assessment table, you also want to set val class equal to null. And that's just kind of been given axiomatically. I don't know if there's been much explanation as to why that's the case. So consider this that explanation. I'm about to tell you guys why you always have to look, if you're looking at the assessment table, you always want to set your val class equal to null. So the way the assessment table is set up, the way impact was designed from the beginning, was to accommodate multi-use parcels. Parcels that have a portion of their value being assessed at one assessment level and another portion of their value being assessed at a different assessment level and then combined together. So for those of you who may have been around in the CAS 3 and CAS 4 days, I'm not as certain about CAS 4, but I know CAS 3 could not handle this kind of configuration. In CAS 3, if you had a parcel that was truly multi-use like this, you had to split it into two accounts. And generally you would have one parcel with all of the, say, residential elements on it, and then you would have a second parcel that would have the same parcel ID just with a different special interest number with all the commercial portions on it, say. So then you would have the special interest 000, the parent parcel, they called it, would be the residential stuff, and then the child parcel 001 would be all the commercial stuff, and they would be just assessed and billed separately as two separate parcels, even though they occupied the same physical parcel space, right? So that was one of the concepts in impact, was to be able to allow that kind of configuration to be keyed onto a single parcel and to be assessed correctly. So I can show you what that looks like here. If you were to key a multi-use parcel, and I've done this, I've created a simple one here. There's no improvements on this parcel. It's completely vacant, and it's only got two landlines. The property type of this parcel is residential, which means that any value elements on it are going to be residential by default, unless I specify otherwise. So I've got these two land records. One of them is residential because the parcel is residential, because I haven't told it otherwise. One of them I've told I want to assess this as commercial land. Both of them, each of these landlines, has an appraised value of $10,000. So I have a residential landline appraised for $10,000, and I have a commercial landline also appraised for $10,000. So, since these are the only two value elements on this parcel, there's no dwelling, there's no OBY, there's no commercial buildings, etc., etc., etc. If you go look at the assessment tab, you can see how these are handled differently. So you can see there's this class field. The class for this parcel is R, and class is always going to be driven, if you look back at the parcel tab, by this property type. Whatever the parcel's overall property type is determines its class. So a 0, 0 property, a residential property, is going to be class R. If I change this to property type 1, it's going to automatically change that class to E for exempt. Or if I changed it to an 11, it's going to change it to A for agricultural, right? So whatever the parcel's overall property type is going to drive the class. So I want to leave that as residential. It's a residential parcel. So it has a class of R. So if you look at the assessment tabs, the assessment tab, look at the assessment records, they all agree with that. They all have class R, but they have three different value classes. This is that val class field. So looking at these two land records that I've got, right? One is residential because the parcel's residential, and the other is commercial because I've defined it, this particular record, as commercial. Because of that, if you look at the assessment tab, each of them, each portion, each assessment level that exists on this parcel will get its own assessment record. So just running down the list here, we've got a commercial assessment record. We've got this assessment record with a class of R because it's a residential parcel, and a val class of C because that land record is commercial. That's what dictates that val class. Because that val class is C, this assessment level down here, the program knows to apply 40% assessment for a commercial portion. The val class is what drives the assessment level. So because that land line is defined as commercial, it gets its own commercial assessment record, where the $10,000 of appraisal is accounted for. The commercial assessment level of 40% is applied to it. So you know that portion of this parcel's appraisal is assessed at $4,000, 40% of $10,000. So there's your commercial assessment portion, 4,000. So the same could be said of the residential portion. Looking at the second assessment record, this one belongs to the residential land line. It also has $10,000 of appraisal, but because this assessment record is val class R, it gets that 25% assessment. Impact knows to go and pull the residential assessment level for this one. So even though it's appraised the same, those two land records are each appraised for $10,000, this $10,000 appraisal is getting the 25% assessment. So it's coming out at $2,500 assessment instead of $4,000 like the commercial portion did. So this makes sense, right? We can see how each assessment level that exists within a parcel is going to wind up with its own assessment record so that it can be assessed at the appropriate level. This amount of the appraisal needs to get 40%. This amount of the appraisal needs to get 25%. Then, once those calculations are done, this third assessment record, in this case, is created. And this is the val class null record. This val class is null. And what it does is sum all of the constituent parts of the previous assessment records. So you can see each of these fields is going to be the sum of the same fields from the other records. So the val class null record shows a total land value for this parcel of $20,000, which is correct, right? $10,000 on this record and $10,000 on that record gives a total appraisal of $20,000. But it's also going to show the total assessment. And it's going to get here on the val class null record the total assessment is not figured by applying an assessment level to the appraisal as it is on the other assessment records. It is the sum of the assessment of the other records. So the commercial assessment is $4,000 and the residential assessment is $2,500, which means that the total assessment for this parcel is $6,500. And the reason it has to be done that way is because even though in this instance it's a simple example of how those assessments are added to get the total assessment for this parcel, but if you were to figure out what percentage that 6,500 is of 20,000, I'm not sure off the top of my head, I can't do that, but it would be some weird split the difference between 25% and 40%, because some of it was 25% assessed and some of it was 40%. So it's not going to be an exact number. And from multi-use parcel to multi-use parcel, that percentage is going to be different depending on what portion of the parcel's appraisal or assessment is residential and what portion of it is commercial. The percentage of total assessment to total appraisal is going to be different from multi-use parcel to multi-use parcel. So that's why they have to be split out into their constituent assessment levels like this. All the commercial stuff has to be assessed on one record, and all the residential stuff has to be assessed on another record, and then the val class null record adds them all together to give you what is the entire parcel's true assessed value. So then by extension, if you look at page 5 and page 6, I've kind of been rambling about this. I don't know if I've been following the book very well. But I mentioned at the top of page 5 that now that we've gotten to this point, now that you guys have an understanding of why there is this val class null record in the first place, when we have batch reports that we run, like if you guys ever go out and run an assessment summary, and your summary kicks out and it tells you how many taxable parcels you have and what the total assessment value is of those parcels and all this different data, that assessment data is coming from the assessment tab, from the assessment table. And when it goes out and pulls numbers from the assessment table, it's looking at this val class is null record. It's excluding any records where the val class is not null. So let's think about this. Let's look at it in a database context. I'm going to go pull this data for this parcel, 14105, in Inquire. I'm going to start a new query, and I'm going to go to the assessment table, and I want to look at jur equals 12, and I want to look at parcel, I think it was 14105. I want to look at tax year 2017. Roll type, I want to set to RP for reasons that I'll explain later. Roll type has to do with distinguishing between real property and personal property. If all your parcel IDs are keyed correctly, then there shouldn't be any overlap there, because all of your personal property accounts should have a P or maybe an I in some rare cases in that property identifier position, which will eliminate the possibility of them being confused. But that's a later conversation. I want to pull the current records, and I want to see the parcel ID and the class, and the assessment table is big. There are a lot of fields. I want to see the val class, and I want to see the assessment. Val-asm 1 is the assessment, I think. So if I hit my filter to see what I'm looking at, I'm pulling everything from 2017 that's current for this parcel in Chester County. So I should get 3 records back, right? There we go. And that mirrors... Uh-oh, what did I do? So you can see, we're looking at these records are from this parcel, right? So going back to my example of from an administrative perspective, I want to run a summary to get my assessed value so I can get a revenue projection because I've got a budget request meeting coming up, right? So that summary is going to include everything in the county or in whatever city or whatever, however you want to run it. But looking at this on an individual parcel basis, the reason for this val class null record is that assessment summary job goes out to the assessment table and pulls these value fields for the val class null records. And the reason it does that is because you can see on this one parcel, if it didn't restrict itself to just the val class null, then this parcel, if you sum these numbers up, it would look like this parcel is assessed for $13,000. If you pulled the total assessment for all assessment records for this parcel, you would get the sum of these three numbers. You get $13,000, which is wrong. This parcel is assessed for $6,500. The other records, the val class C and the val class R, the records where val class is not null, are prior steps in the calculation process. They're not supposed to be included in the total. So that's why if you're looking at values, you only want to look at the val class as null record. It would mess up your parcel counts too. If you didn't restrict yourself to val class as null, if the assessment summary didn't restrict itself to val class as null, then this record, this parcel would be counted 3 times because it has 3 records on here. So your total parcel count would come out to be 2 to 3 times what your actual parcel count is if the summary didn't restrict itself to that val class as null record. So you may be saying at this point, this is fine and dandy for multi-use parcels, parcels that have multiple records like this that need to be summed because they can't have a single uniform assessment level applied to them because of their mixed use. But for normal parcels, for parcels that are all residential or commercial, why do we need that val class null record? They'll only have 2 records, and I'll show you that here. If I were to go over here and take this class off, if I make this not a multi-use parcel anymore and validate it, it's going to combine the assessment records, the assessment tab. What it's going to do is it's going to deactivate that commercial record because it's not necessary anymore, and it's going to combine the other $10,000 into the residential record. So now this is what the vast majority of just regular parcels are going to look like on the assessment tab. They're just going to have these 2 records, and the val class R record and the val class null record should be exactly the same. They should mirror each other now. Because if you think about it in the terms of the val class null record is the sum of all previous records, well, in a multi-use context, that makes sense. Because the val class C record and the val class R record are added together to make the val class null record. In a context like we have right here, the logic holds even though that may not be how you would normally think about it. The val class null record is the sum of all other records. It's just that you only have one other record. So the sum winds up being exactly the same. So from a mathematical, operational standpoint, it's doing the same thing. It just looks kind of superfluous in this case. So you may think to yourself, this val class null situation is fine for multi-use records. That makes sense. Why do we still need a val class null record for the 98% of parcels that are not multi-use, that are not multi-class? Well, the reason for that, like I said, is because the assessment summary specifically, I've mentioned a couple of times, but any of our batch reports, any of our jobs that concern values are coded to look at that val class null record. So if you run an assessment summary, when we run our assessment change notices, if you guys use any of the, and these are all mentioned on page 5, if you use the appraisal change report, I think is AA 700, I think. The Greenbelt change report that compares year to year, I can't remember what its report number is, um, even up to our tax bills. When we run our tax billing jobs, all of these reports were designed from the beginning to look at val class is null in order to accommodate the possibility of multi-use parcels. Because of that, every parcel has to have a val class null record, whether it's multi-use or not. Because the val class, for the val class not null records, dictates what assessment level that record gets. And then the null record is the sum of all the other assessment records that exist on a parcel. I'm going to change this one back to the way it was. So the null record is the sum of all other assessment records. And then the null record is what drives actual data calculations, value calculations in our broader reports. So all of this to explain how the assessment table works specifically, why we've always told you if you're looking at the assessment table, you want to specify val class is null, because that's kind of the controlling record is how you can think of it. That's the record that has the actual values for that parcel on it. Even though in cases where a parcel is not multi-use, the two records that exist on those parcels should mirror each other. It's always just safer to look at val class as null. So that's where that comes from. Just in the same way we always tell you, you want to check cur equals y. When you're looking at the assessment tab, you also want to check val class is null. So the other note that I have to kind of touch on with you guys is I've noticed when working on queries with some of our field staff or some of the county personnel is that when you guys are setting up these queries to pull values, a lot of you are apt to use the APR val table instead of the assessment table. And while generally I think that's okay, I personally shy away from using the APR val table. Generally because I think that the habit was bred into me from having to deal with counties that had just converted into impact and had a lot of things that were still on override values, and so values might be kind of mismatched in those situations. And so the longer we spend on impact, the further we get from having everybody converted that we're going to have converted, the less of an issue that is. The other thing I can think of that I would recommend against the APR val table because of is the way that greenbelt parcels values are stored. And I can't really give you any specific examples off the top of my head, but I know that when you start with greenbelt parcels, when there are ag land records involved, sometimes the relationship between those ag land record values and the APR val table values and the assessment table values can get kind of out of whack. Again, I'm not sure specifically what happens, but I know that they can be kind of misleading sometimes. So for those reasons, I try to recommend if you're building a query that has to do with values, it's always a better idea to use the assessment table if you can instead of the APR val table, just because it's going to have, for one thing, it's going to have the val class null record is going to have exactly what's on that parcel, and for another reason, whether these values are correct or not, these are the values that are going to display on your assessment summary. These are the values that are going to display on your assessment change notices. These are the values that are going to display or that are going to drive your tax bills. So in terms of consistency across reports, the assessment table data is where this data is coming from for all these different reports. So in general, if you're looking at values, you want to look at the assessment table instead of the APR val table. All right, so we've kind of gone over some general concepts is what I called the section of the book. Some basic like jargon and theory about the way data is stored in the database. And like I said a couple of times, if some of the concepts didn't quite make sense or seemed kind of strange, I will, as we're talking about these queries over the next couple of sessions, I'll circle back and point out where the concepts apply to kind of illustrate how these things work. So we talked about the concepts and the theory, and I've kind of explained to you guys how the assessment table works, because that's an important understanding. So, to kind of wrap things up today, I'm going to spend a little bit of time. I'm going to talk to you guys about the first dynamic field. I'm only going to spend a little bit of time in Inquire today, which is kind of misleading. But the second and third sessions will be a lot more query heavy. We'll do a lot more with dynamic fields and some other tables that we have built that I'll show you guys later. But for today, I want to show you guys the first of the dynamic fields. And this is where, from an Inquire perspective, we may be getting into some territory that that some of you or a lot of you might be unfamiliar with. So like I said at the top, at the beginning, I kind of designed this with the assumption that you guys have a basic understanding of Inquire. Like you can run simple searches to maybe if you want to find parcels that are still on override value, or identify all your home sites on ag parcels, like basic searches like that. I would hope that you guys would be able to all either perform these searches or figure out how to. Like you may not know what some of those field names off the top of your head are, which is fine. You know, nobody knows all of these field names. But at this point, you should hopefully be able to do simple searches like that. If not, it's no big deal. Plenty of time to learn. But so getting into, like I said, something you guys may not be as familiar with is these dynamic fields, how these dynamic fields work. So this is getting more into defining your own kind of functions. So what I'm going to do, let me see, I've got some of these queries saved. I'm going to open the first dynamic field I'm going to talk to you guys about. The only one I'm going to talk to you guys about today is the average field. And I've got this query saved. I'm going to pull it up. And I'm looking at the sales table in this query. So I'm going to load it. Like I said, I had set all this up beforehand and saved it. I'm going to filter this down so I can see what I'm looking at. So as this query is set up now, I'm looking at Chester County. I'm looking at current records, cur equals Y. I'm looking at instrument type equals WD, so that instrument type field is exactly what it sounds like. It's what kind of deed, and WD is warranty deed, right? And then sale date. Like I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the sales tab, there's no tax year field, but you can use the sale date field to kind of narrow into a specific calendar year or a specific portion of a calendar year like I've done here. I'm only looking at a specific quarter. I want to pull sales that took place between October 1st and December 31st of 2015. So what I've done here is these query conditions have defined the collection of data that I'm going to analyze, but I don't have anything selected. I don't have anything selected to show. So if I try to run this query as it is, I'm going to get an error message. No output fields were specified. So that's most of these error messages will tell you or kind of give you an idea of what they mean. Some of them are downright cryptic. But this one's pretty straightforward. No output fields were specified. Okay, so I forgot to select anything. Which is what I want for now. So this is going to be how these dynamic fields work. So when working with a dynamic field, the first thing you want to do is set up your data. Like I said, I've defined the collection of data that I want to analyze. The dynamic field is going to let me define what kind of analysis I want to do on this data. So for this first dynamic field, to add them, first of all, this plus button up here next to your filter. I've heard some people call this the martini glass. I think of it as a funnel. Whatever, however you look at it, that's that filter. Next to the filter button is the dynamic field button, or add dynamic field, that plus. So if you click on it, you get this pop-out window, this dynamic field window. So first, you can name any of your dynamic fields whatever you want to. The only restriction to naming this field is that since I'm adding this to the sales table, I can't name it something that already exists on this table. So for example, there's already an instrument type field, INSTR-TYP. INSTR-TYP. So if I tried to use the same name, and I want to do, and I'll explain all this in a second. I want to do average of, what did I do, price? Yeah. It's going to give me an error message. A field with the name instrument type already exists. So except for the fact that I can't name it after a field that already exists on the table to which I'm trying to add it, I can name it anything I want. Blah, blah, blah. I'm going to call it, usually helpful to name it something informative, right? I'm going to call it average price because that's what I want to do here. I want this dynamic field to find the average of price. So I'm going to name it something that'll indicate what it's actually doing, what data it contains. And then in the field type, if you remember, when this first came up, now of course it's not going to show me now, I'm going to cancel. So if I name this average price, I know what I want this field to be, what I want it to be. So once I've named it, this field type box is where I'm going to select one of my 6 dynamic fields. These are your 6 options. Like I said, I'm going to talk about the average of today, and then in later sessions 2 and 3, I'll talk about the other dynamic fields. But when you select one, when I select average of, for example, like y'all might have noticed earlier, I get these additional fields underneath, source field and decimal places. So what I'm telling Inquire here is that I've got this collection of data defined. These currently active warranty deeds from the last quarter of 2015 in Chester County, right? That's my world of data. And with that data, I want to find the average of, and then it asks me what field, the average of what field. So I then have to select the field that I want it to calculate the average of. So if I come down here to the price field, is where the sale price is stored on each sales record. And it's even asking me how many decimal places I want to see. So I'm going to tell it 2 because I want to see cents, right? Dollars and cents, right? I'm getting a dollar amount, so I want to see the pennies. So what I'm telling Inquire is, for this collection of data, calculate me the average of the price field to 2 decimal places. You can construct this as a statement, right? What is the average of price to 2 decimal places? I'm going to click OK. And there's my dynamic field. When you add your dynamic field, it will show up at the bottom. And if I didn't have this filtered out, I'm going to unfilter it. You can see it does truly show up at the very bottom of your table. And there it is. So now, as this is defined, when I run this, I should only get 1 record back, because that's all I'm selecting is the dynamic field that I've defined. So I should only get that 1 record back, and it should only be 1 number. It should be the average of the price field for all of the sales that meet these criteria. And for this, I'm on page 7 and moving on to page 8 in that manual. It's been a while since I put this manual together, so the numbers might not agree anymore. They do agree. So you can see the average is, there's a screenshot on page 8, about a third of the way down the page. You can see it's that $104,461.66. And if you wanted to double check that, you could go through the rigmarole of, I'm going to remove my dynamic field, and I'm going to alter my query to include the price, and I'm going to run that. No, I'm not going to run that yet, because I also want to see the parcel and the sale key, so that I know I'm getting all the correct results. So when I run that query without my dynamic field, what I can see is that for those criteria, Chester County warranty deeds in October, November, and December of 2015, I'm getting 56 results. If you spit this out into a spreadsheet and ran an average on that price column, you would get $104,461 and 2/3 and 66 cents. So you can do that if you're playing with queries. That's another thing I try to emphasize to folks is if you're trying to do something, if you're trying to build a query that's relatively complicated, you're never or very rarely going to be able to sit down at Inquire, build your entire query, and run it and get the results you expect. More often than not, you're going to have to put a simple query together and run it and see what it does, and modify that a little bit and add a little bit to it and run it and see what it does, and then modify that a little bit. And so it's an ongoing evolutionary process, especially with more complex queries and queries like this where you're getting into using dynamic fields. You're very rarely going to be able to put together a complicated query all at once and run it and have it work exactly as you expect. That's a rarity. There's always some tuning and adjustment involved. So to that end, in a situation like this, if you sit down and set this query up and put your average price dynamic field on here and run it, and you get your number, and you think, well, that seems weird, or that seems a little low or a little high or whatever, you're unsure of this for whatever reason, then you can do what I just did. You can remove the dynamic field and pull the actual records for the data you're looking at and check that price by hand. Check that average, that calculation manually, and see if you get the same result. If you do that manually and get the same result, then that'll verify, okay, this average price field or whatever you've done is doing what I expect it to. There's not something unexpected or unforeseen going on under the hood. And then once you've verified that it's doing what you indeed expect it to, you can save the query and come back to it later and tweak pieces of it to suit your situational needs instead of having to rebuild and re-verify these queries every time you need them. Or on the other hand, if you run this and get an average and think, that seems weird, I'm going to double check that, and you run through all your calculations and there's something wrong, well then that is an equally valuable experience, right? Then you have proven to yourself that there's something going on here that you don't understand. And then you can set about finding out what it is that's going on that has escaped your attention, or asking someone for help, which is always advisable. If nothing else, sometimes an extra set of eyes will pick up on something that you've spent an hour and a half trying to find. You know, I will frequently spend a lot of time trying to diagnose something and get nowhere, and then ask someone else for input, and they will immediately or almost immediately spot something that I was overlooking. Running a manual calculation and realizing that your dynamic field, your aggregate function, whatever, is not working exactly as you expected it to or intended it to, could help lead to further insights about how Inquire works in general. Anyway, so all that to say, there's no shame in asking for help. Nobody is expecting any of us to be able to sit down and do this perfectly or even well all at once. It's a complicated program, and there are complicated concepts that take time to learn. Having said that, part of learning these concepts is just going out there and running queries. Run this query, run that query. What'll this do? What'll that do? Experiment and play around and see how things work differently. Because for one thing, you're not going to break anything. You can run queries in Inquire all day long. If it's a particularly big query, it might time out, but you're not going to, none of this is changing any data. None of this is interrupting any processes. So there's nothing to stop you guys from going out and running any type of query you can contrive just to see how it works. And getting in there and messing around with it will help you develop a comprehension of how it works. So anyway, okay, so I've added the dynamic field, my average dynamic field in this case, to this query, and it's given me that average. So by extension then, there are other things that you can do with this. Sorry, I'm flipping through my notes to make sure I'm not missing anything. So this is the kind of thing that, like, it's neat to be able to run this query, but what is the significance here? Why is this important? Who cares, basically? Who cares that the average sale price of all these deeds is 104,461, et cetera, et cetera? So this exact query may not be one that has any bearing, but it could be, like I was talking about earlier, about setting up a query and then modifying it a little bit, and then running it, and then adding to it a little bit, and then running it. This could be a foundational query for something that is more meaningful. So in this case, this might not be as meaningful, just knowing what the average price of all these deeds is, but what if I wanted to break this down into, say, improved and vacant sales? I think is the easy example. It's the example that's in the book. If I wanted to break this down into improved and vacant sales, what I would do is I'm going to unfilter my results so that I'm looking at the entire sales table. The first thing you'd have to know is where that information is kept. If I wanted to break this down into improved and vacant sales, I'd have to know where the sale is specified as being vacant or improved. Well, I know, I think I've still got this parcel up, hang on. May be able to see here. This VI field on the sales tab, if you hover over it, is the sale type field. And this one doesn't have it. Okay, this record has it defined as V, vacant. So sale type, if I go and then in this query, which is still exactly the same as it was a minute ago, it's still the same query. It's going to run and give me the average price for that quarter, for warranty deeds for that quarter. If I instead want to see average price of improved and vacant sales, if I want to break it down into groups, I want to include that information in my query. So what I mean by that is, remember that field is called sale type. So here's that sale type field. I'm going to select it to show. That's all I'm going to do is include it in my query results. So I'm going to refilter my query. And now that's the only change I've made. I'm going to expand my query results. This result is from when I ran it earlier without sale type included, right? So all I've done is check that box next to sale type. If I run this query now, I'm going to get two records. So when I was talking earlier, if you look back on page, bear with me, if you look back on page 4, about halfway down the page, I talk about grouping data. This is what that means. The fact that I have included sale type in my output results, I didn't condition by it at all. I don't only want to see vacants or improved. I want to include it in my output. by including that sale type as part of my output, I'm automatically grouping my dynamic field function by each value in that sale type field. So basically what I'm saying here, thinking about it from the other direction. Remember when we started, I had not even that. I'm gonna go back even further. When we started, when I loaded this query up to begin with, I had this set up, remember? And it's not going to bring me anything because I have no output fields specified. To begin with, I had this query because, like I said, when working with dynamic fields, you want to define the data you want to analyze and then add the field that will do the analysis you want to perform on that data. So now extending that a step, I want to include that sale type field. So again, just by checking that box, just by including sale type, if I run this now, I'm going to get two records back, an I and a V. What I'm asking for here, if I translated this query into plain English, what I'm asking Inquire to do is tell me all of the sale types, all of the values that exist in sale type for the sales records that meet these criteria. For all the sales records in Chester County that are currently active, that are warranty deeds, that have a sale date in this time period, show me all the sale types that exist. And for that world of data, there are two sale types, I and V. Then, by adding the dynamic field, average of price to two decimal places, by adding this dynamic field, what I'm saying is I'm extending that logic. I'm saying, okay, I've got the list of all sale types that exist in the sales records that meet these conditions. Then I'm extending that to say, for each of these sale types, do this dynamic field analysis. So now that I've added that dynamic field, I'm saying, for each group of data, my group of sales that have a sale type I and my group of sales that have a sale type V, those are my only two groups because those are the only two values in the sale type field for these records. What I'm telling my query here is, for these groups of data, the I's and the V's, perform this analysis on each group. So it's grouping that average by what's in the sale type field. So that's what I mean by grouping data. I'm selecting a list of distinct sale types that exist on these records. And then I'm asking Inquire to perform, calculate the average price within each group. I'm grouping that average by sale type. So in doing that, I'm getting the average sale price for all the improved parcels, or the improved sales, I guess. And I'm getting the average sale price for the vacant parcels. And I think, I don't want to make a liar out of myself, but I think that if you added these two numbers together and divided by 2, if you took the average of these two numbers, I think you would get 104,461.66. So that's one way you could check yourself. Or alternatively, by including that sale type in my results again, you could do the same thing that I was talking about doing earlier. You could go back and get all of the actual sales records and include that sale type field so that you can discern which ones are improved and which ones are vacant, and then run the calculation by hand in a spreadsheet. This is the average of all of the improved sale prices, and this is the average of all of the vacant sale prices. And you can double check to make sure that what you're getting matches what Inquire is spitting out. So these examples are in your book. All I've done with this average of field this morning in the last 10 or 15 minutes, are things that are in your book on pages 7, 8, and a little bit on page 9. I have over-explained every step of the way, but everything I've done is in your book. So I'm going to show you one more step with this dynamic field that is not in the book, another step of complication that will help illustrate how this data is grouped together. So when we started with this query, we were getting an average sale price for warranty deeds for the quarter, right? It was 104 or something. And like I said, you may ask yourself, okay, who cares? What significance does that data have? Well, then, like I said, you can use that as the foundational query. You can then add more data to your output results to break down what that dynamic field is doing into more useful information. So now that I've added sale type, it's giving me an average improved sale price and an average vacant sale price. Well, that's a little more meaningful. That's a little more indicative of things, right? What if I want to get even more granular? I could break this down any way I wanted to. What if I wanted to do this by neighborhood also? What if I was doing neighborhood analyses? I could do the same thing that I did here with sale type. All I would need to do to break this down by neighborhood as well as by sale type would be to include the neighborhood information, the neighborhood field, in my output results. The complication there is that if you unfilter this, or if you guys should all, like I said, those of you with a basic working knowledge of Inquire should know right off the bat that if I'm looking at the sales table, a parcel's neighborhood information does not exist on sales. I'm going to have to add another table to my query to get the neighborhood. So some of you may know, some of you may not, where the neighborhood field actually lives. It's on the Pardat table. I'm going to pull this up so I can show you. If you didn't know where it is, if you're in Inquire and you're thinking, I need to include the neighborhood field, but I don't know what table that's on, what you want to do, the easiest way to find out this kind of thing, where is this field, what is this field called, etc., is to pull up an actual parcel in maintain. Doesn't matter what parcel, just some parcel, and find the piece of data you're looking for. In this case, it's neighborhood. So I want to look at, it might be on like legal, maybe. So I'm going to look around on legal, and it's not, there's no neighborhood on here. So maybe it's on parcel, and I'm going to look, hey, neighborhood. There's my neighborhood field. So now I know this is the Pardat table, or I could get that tooltip to tell me, hey, this is Pardat. And then I can look at this field to see it's NBHD, neighborhood is the name of that field. So now I know that I'm going to have to load the Pardat table and select the neighborhood field to get that neighborhood information. So I'm going to go back to Inquire. I'm going to go back to my data sets. Whoops. I'm going to look in my Gamma data sets, and I'm going to load that Pardat table. I'm going to click on it, and notice when I clicked, it shows up in my query definition down here. I'm still looking at my sales fields, though, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Pardat. The first thing I want to do, first thing you always want to do when you're adding a new table, is set cur equals to y. Cur equals y. Then I don't have to define jur or parid. I might want to go ahead and define tax year. See, jur and parid are automatically going to take their cue from the sales table. So the fact that I have jur defined on sales means I don't have to define it on Pardat. And parcel ID, I don't want to define a specific parcel ID. I want to look at all parcels. So I want to leave those blank anyway. On the Pardat table, because the sales table does not have a tax year, I'm going to go ahead and define that. I'm going to say tax year equals 2017. And then, because remember what we're doing here is I've got my average query broken down by improved sales and vacant sales, but I want to see an even greater level of detail. I want to see broken down my neighborhood also. So on the Pardat table, I'm going to scroll down to that neighborhood field. And just like I did with the sale type field on sales, is where that improved and vacant information is stored, right? I just want to check that box next to neighborhood. So if I filter this table, this is another thing, there's a new filter all function. I'll show you in a second. If I filter this pardat table, I can see that all I've done is I'm looking for currently active pardat records in tax year 2017, but the only thing I've added to my query results is that neighborhood field. So if I unfilter the table and filter the whole query, now I can see everything that pertains to my query on both tables. So my sales query, my sales table hasn't changed. I'm looking at the same quarter, the same warranty deeds, the same jurisdiction. I'm including sale type in my output results, and there's my dynamic field. My average is being applied to each group of sale type, right? Except now, what I'm including neighborhood in my search results also. So now that I'm including two fields, neighborhood and sale type, in my search results, what my search results are going to give me is every unique combination of neighborhood and sale type, along with an average. So let's see what that looks like. If I run that, now suddenly I'm getting a lot more information. So I'm going to sort this. I'm actually going to go in here, I think. Yeah, configure output fields. No, not configure output fields. I'm going to go into the A to Z, the sort. I want to sort it by neighborhood and by sale type. I'm going to save that and I'm going to execute. So now you can see we're still working with the same records. We defined that initial world of data. Chester County warranty deeds in this quarter. We're still working with the same records. We're just breaking it down to a different level. So now we can see that in neighborhood H30, vacant sales have an average sale price of $19,900. In neighborhood H31, improved sales have an average price of $155,000. The reason I did that configure output fields and sorted by neighborhood and sale type is you can see right here, here's an example where H50, neighborhood H50 is represented once for improved sales and once for vacant sales. So the fact that I'm including sale type and neighborhood in my query results, these are now my groups. These are now my data groups. Neighborhood H30 vacant, neighborhood H31 improved, neighborhood H50 improved, neighborhood H50 vacant. So each unique combination of these two fields that exists in that collection of data is going to be a single group. And then for each of those groups, the average dynamic field, the dynamic field that we added, is going to calculate an average of the price that exists on those sales records. So for all vacant sales in neighborhood H30, this is the average price, etc., etc. So in this way, this is what I meant by data grouping. By adding more output to your, adding more fields to your output results, you're changing the groups of data that your dynamic field function is being applied to. So in that way, you know, we started with that very basic simple query that was just giving us the average sale price for that collection of data of $104,000 and some odd dollars. And now, just by adding other fields to our output, we've come up with this probably much more useful, much more meaningful data, right? Doing this kind of analysis, you can break down through a relatively simple query. You could break down and look and see, okay, for vacant and improved sales in this neighborhood for such and such a tax year, my average was whatever. Or if I wanted to, since I have the pardat field in my query now, I'm going to unfilter this. If I wanted to do this instead of by looking at by neighborhood, what if I wanted to do this by property type? Because the LUC field, property type, exists on pardat. So I could do the same thing. I just unselected neighborhood, and I'm going to select property type. So now if I run this, it's going to give me each unique combination of sale type and property type and perform an average on those. Or I could do both, property type and neighborhood. If I put neighborhood back in my query, and run this, I'm going to come up with a lot more records. So now I'm getting unique combinations of those 3 fields. So all of the residential improved parcels in neighborhood H50 sold for an average of 140, 630, and 38 cents. All of the vacant commercial parcels in neighborhood H70. So just by adding and subtracting, not adding and subtracting, but adding and removing specific fields to your output results, you're changing the group of data that your aggregate function, your dynamic field, is performing its calculation on. So that's what I meant back at the beginning of the course when I was talking about grouping data. The way your data, the way your functions group together is going to change based on what data you're including in your output results. And so that's something that I'll, in the following subsequent sessions, 2 and 3, especially as I talk more about these dynamic fields, I will talk about data grouping a lot more and how how these functions are applied to different groups. So I think that brings us to the end of the first session. So for you guys that were able to join us, thanks. I appreciate it. I hope y'all were able to get something out of this, and we will keep y'all updated on when sessions 2 and 3 are going to happen, and we hope to have recordings of all these sessions available at some point in the near future so that you guys can watch them whenever you want to, or show them to new hires or whatever. So yeah, that brings us to the end of today's session. If there are any questions or concerns, y'all feel free to get in touch with me. I don't know if I said so at the beginning of the day. I think most of you know who I am. My name is Elliot Meyer. I work for Division of Property Assessments. Obviously, I work in the Nashville office. And my phone number, in case anybody needs to get in touch with me or anybody has like an Inquire question or something like that, my desk number is area code 615-401-7876. So yeah, any questions or complications or concerns or anything, feel free to get in touch. And thanks for attending.